All right. Welcome everyone. I'm going to kick us off with a little introduction. My name is Shanta. I'm a research associate here at Transitions Research, and I'm part of the PUL or the People's Urban Living Lab team. I've done some work on mobility policy in Panjim, which is one of our project cities. For anyone who is new to this Talking About Transition series, the series features critical conversations on systemic transitions at the interplay of technology, society, and sustainability. So, to understand a little bit more about how we're going to kick off the discussion, I will give you a brief description of what we're going to get into. The way we move contributes to almost a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions world over, much of which are derived from cities. Whether we choose to use public transport, to walk, or to cycle, or to take a private vehicle to travel, contributes to rising greenhouse gas emissions. The situation in India is no different from that. Over the last 20 years, India has experienced a surge in mobility and transport-related emissions, with GHG emissions increasing 224% between 2000 and 2019. Cities which are rapidly growing have felt the brunt of this shift, with many cities experiencing unbearable congestion, poor public transport provision, and rising air pollution. India is at a pivotal moment to shape the future of transport emissions, especially given that only 30% of urban residents currently rely on private vehicles. Without radical interventions in city design and normative shifts away from private vehicles, we run the risk of driving urban emissions to unsustainable levels, which is in direct conflict, of course, with our net zero and climate goals. The push towards sustainable mobility rests on a few key ideas, one of which is non-motorized transport. There's dense and transit-oriented development and related concepts like 15-minute cities, the electrification of mobility to reduce emissions, and the need for massive shifts towards public transport. In this conversation, we aim to explore both approaches to urban mobility in the context of sustainable development in cities, mostly in the global south. So we want to ask, what are the challenges in implementing innovative ideas in mobility, like concepts like the 15-minute cities or walkable, cyclable cities? Can electrification really transform mobility emissions as much as we think that it can? And what happens after we design and plan for our cities? What social and behavioral changes are needed to transition transport? And finally, what kind of mobility systems do we need for a low carbon future? I'm going to talk right now quite a bit while I introduce everybody, but then I will be handing it off to the speakers. So I'm going to quickly introduce them all. So we are lucky to have Anna Walter Docks, who is a behavioral economist and expert on fostering sustainable habits. In the last 7 years, she has consulted more than 20 public and private sector clients and facilitated behavior change in areas such as waste management and mobility. One of her favorite projects was a field experiment on reducing littering in Vienna's social housing, with over 70,000 participants impacted. Currently, Anna is working on shaping the transport of tomorrow as a behavior designer within Austria's largest mobility provider, OBB. Welcome, Anna.
Thanks.
Second, we have Karthik Kuppu, who is a strategy consultant with 6 years of experience across India, the US, Canada, and the UAE. He has a background in non-motorized transport, public transport, mobility as a service, ACES mobility, and first mile, last mile strategies. His expertise spans across digital transformation, product development, and strategic planning domains, particularly within mobility startups, automotive companies, and public transport agencies. His work focuses on leveraging data and technology to drive innovation and efficiency in urban mobility projects. Karthik holds a Master's of City Planning from MIT, where he was a researcher at the Urban Mobility Lab, and a Bachelor of Architecture from IIT Kharagpur. Suryata Pare Chaudhary is our third speaker. She is a researcher and urban design practitioner who incorporates systems thinking, sustainable design and construction, and socially inclusive architecture into her work. She is currently associated with Jana Urban Space Foundation, where her responsibilities include drafting policy and knowledge products, advocacy, government engagement, and conducting research at the intersection of public space design, gender equity, climate sensitivity, and social inclusivity. Previously, she worked as an urban designer at Nikken Sekkei in Tokyo and as an architect at HCPDPM in Ahmedabad. And she's a recipient of the Norman Foster Foundation 2019 On Cities Fellowship. Welcome, everyone. I hope we're going to have a really great discussion today. And thank you all participants for joining so far. Finally, I will let them speak as experts on mobility. And I'll kick us off with a question for all of the panelists. What does sustainable and low carbon mobility look like in cities and developing countries? So what needs to change and who is responsible for those shifts? I will open it up to whoever wants to answer first.
Okay, I can go ahead. Well, clearly walking and biking, so active mobility is nice. But I think if we're talking about developing countries and so on, the focus, given your population numbers, is really on public transport. And I'm not talking about buses or on-demand shuttles, but really about mass transit. So, trains, double-decker metros, and so on. And for me, a second key aspect is the so-called just transition. So that's important anywhere, but I would say even more so in developing countries. We know that the mobility habits of the most wealthy and the most vulnerable parts of a society differ very much, and so does their carbon emission profile also. And so a just transition for me has really these two aspects of fairness and inclusivity. What I mean by fairness is we can't have just the vulnerable bear the burden or the effort of engaging in low carbon mobility. It needs to be a shared responsibility, and policies need to make sure that everyone contributes according to their means. So especially the very wealthy population parts. This is fairness, and then inclusivity is everyone needs to be able to use these systems, to use public transport. For example, if I make the footpath wider because I want to have the woman with her stroller, it also benefits groups of friends who might want to walk next to each other. And it's not so much of a sacrifice as we're always painting it. And now, who carries the responsibility? I already touched a bit upon that. And as a behavioral scientist, my daily work is to change individual people's behavior, but that won't suffice. The time's ticking, and I do think we need systemic change. So it needs to be very clear and indisputable that sustainable mobility is the way to go, and policies need to shape norms to that. And I think that the city of Bogota has a very beautiful example of the ciclovia, where they shut down the city every Sunday to cars, and people can just use the street for biking, for skating, whatever. So it is possible, and if you have a vision, then you need to try to make that reality very fast.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so true. And I believe justness and fairness in our transitions is going to come up a lot throughout this conversation, and I hope so too. Can I get Suryatapa to answer as well?
Sure, I think very interesting points, Anna. But yeah, just going back to the original question and framing it from my perspective, I think we need to look, and this is very specific to India, I would say, but I would say also applies to global South cities. We need to look at the way people move and not at what takes up the most amount of space on a road, right? Which is to move to a people-centric and services-centric and not to, and shift from the car-centric perspective that currently we have in India. Just picking up some numbers, a little bit outdated because they're based on Census 11. 80% of commuters in India travel on foot for distances up to 1 kilometer. Between 2 to 5 kilometer, the share of walkers range between 50 to 75%. In the same kilometer range, 75% of trips are either by walking, cycling, or public transport. Women primarily use buses or walking as their primary mode of transit. As per, again, Census 2011, 84% of their trips to work were either by public, IPT, or walking and cycling. Mostly walking, little less cycling. 50% of children walk to school, 18% cycle, 9% children use public buses. I think if we can build infrastructure that speaks to this data, we are already enabling a significant shift to low carbon mobility. Building roads that enable walking, cycling, and use of public transport. I think these are the three primary concerns that we need to target head on. Ensure a better penetration of public transport across every city. And here, I think e-mobility do come in, but I think even when we speak about e-mobility, we need to look at, we can't just say that e-vehicles are going to solve the problem unless we have an entire clean transition for energy at source, right? So as we are speaking about low emission zones and low carbon mobility, I think that's something that we need to keep at the back of our mind. And finally, I think we need to start looking at planning as an enabler to ensure that all our basic services and amenities are within a 15-minute walking and cycling distance. So start planning more at a local level and not at the city level. That is also necessary, but I think this is more implementable and project centric. If we get the steps right, I think we have already solved for a significant part of this transition to low carbon mobility. And in terms of like who is responsible for this shift, I feel like every stakeholder has a part to play. Decisions and bureaucrats have their part to play in terms of deciding where the vision, deciding where the path, deciding where the budget allocations are for infrastructure development. They are the ones who are basically implementing authorities, right? So I think the significant amount of shift needs to come in their mindset, but also as technical experts, as researchers, as policy experts, like sitting around the table here. A big part of the onus is on us to aggressively advocate for this type of change. And finally, it's also about the consumers, right? Because a large part of the push also comes from them. Some of it, I think we can also discuss as where this conversation goes ahead. But people also need to start accepting and realizing that, yes, pedestrians might be like an invisible portion, like invisible segment on the road. Like you do not actually, because the car takes up most amount of space, you're automatically thinking that that is what you need to design the road for. But we also, as consumers, you and I, we also need to start thinking differently, changing that our perspective on how people and services and goods actually travel in Indian cities and villages as well. And I think, yeah, so it's sort of like across every stakeholder, there has to be some amount of shift that needs to happen. I'll stop here.
No, definitely that's a very interesting point as well about how many people are already walking and how over the next couple of years that's likely to change, right? As people's means improve, hopefully. If we're still designing for cars and they're going to want to get to that level, upscale whatever they're doing and get a vehicle of their own
Yeah.
rather than planning to walk some more. Like it almost seems like your way out of that is to get a car as opposed to making that infrastructure more accessible. And it's funny, you also brought up how electric mobility is not it's not as encompassing a solution. And actually it was Karthik who told me in our last call that, electric mobility only reduces tailpipe emissions to zero. It's not actually zero emission, which I don't think a lot of people know. So on that note, I'll let you speak more on that.
Sure, thanks, Shanta. I think most of the points I wanted to say were covered by Anna and Suryatapa. But just to add on top of that, one of the quotes that really resonate with me is one from the mayor of Bogota. He says that, a really developed country is not where the poor own cars. It's one where the rich take public transport. And I think that kind of like encapsulates so many points that needs to be changed in developing countries such as India for us to move towards low carbon mobility. Just going on that, I think just the entire idea of cars being a symbol of status, something that people hold on to, rather than its functionality, is something that drives a lot of the choices that Indians make here when it comes to public transport, or taking the public transport or taking a private vehicle. I think bringing a behavioral shift will drive what is needed, which is the modal shift towards public transport. We all know public transport is much low in carbon emissions than an ordinary vehicle, ordinary private vehicle. And also when we compare the life cycle emissions of private electric vehicles, definitely public transport is the winner. So the entire modal shift is something that needs to be first pushed in India. Along with that, I think when that modal shift happens, like Anna said, we shouldn't be leaving the vulnerable population, especially ones at the margin, behind. Making special provisions for people with disability, special provisions for women, like these this idea brought in Chennai, where there are certain buses that run free for women. Enabling certain groups to travel on public transport is very, very essential. And that brings me to answer the last part of your question, which is that the kind of enabler here would be policies. You have the carrot and the stick. The carrot is definitely more effective than the stick. We need to incentivize that move be it through mobility as a service, through digital means, through data, make it more easier to take end-to-end public transport, especially in that being the first and last mile bit, that's the biggest challenge. So I think moving in the policy direction in one that has incentives rather than regulations and legislation is the way to go for India.
Yeah, so I think the points that reached across, and I feel actually everyone did add something completely new to this discussion, but it seems like the two sides of it are the justness and fairness aspect, which is that on the one hand, the just part means that all the infrastructure that currently doesn't seem to cater so much to vulnerable populations, like pedestrianization being a key solution for that. That's one half of it. And then the other part, which is trying to get people to see not only behaviorally in terms of like status shifts and things like that, that public transport is the way to go, but to incentivize it and make it so accessible and available to people that they all are actually happy to use it instead of using it because of the emissions or even because of, any other reason. So yeah, I think this is a great start. And now I can jump into asking you individual questions. So the first one is for Surya Tapa. In India and many countries across the global south, cities exhibit high levels of spatial segregation, right? So, what strategies can be employed to ensure or to at least begin to put in place the 15-minute city concept, where all essential services are located within a 15-minute walk for all residents, especially if it is to promote inclusivity and avoid reinforcing socioeconomic exclusion? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Sorry. It's so interesting that you are to ask about spatial segregation, because this is something that, when we were, I think every planner sort of faces that at some point in their career or in their studies, like academic career. We ourselves, when we were working on 15-minute neighborhoods, this is something that was there somewhere in the back of our heads that, but I'll start from somewhere else. Like if we just observe the planning and development trajectory of any country or city or state, there is a very interesting nexus, I feel, between urbanization, development, and affordability. The more rapidly a city, state, country urbanizes, the demand for development, which is the provision of good quality services and amenities, increases, right? Because you need to cater to more people getting access to the equal amount of services. The more development you have, it will automatically raise land value, etc., right? Maybe my co-panelists can share their thoughts on this perhaps better from different perspectives. But one inevitable outcome of development is that specific areas in the city will become unaffordable to low-income populations. This is not just related to housing. It is not just housing affordability. It is also related to how much accessible and affordable your produce markets are, how affordable schooling is in that neighborhood, how affordable your daycare centers are. And it is a fact that, based on the type of neighborhood that you stay in, the premium that you pay for certain basic services will be different, right? This sort of a very natural, organic sort of development is what leads to segregation. And I would say this is perhaps why spatial segregation, mostly based on income in this case, is somewhat inevitable in the development trajectory of any country, right? That said, I think the 15-minute neighborhood concept actually targets this problem head on, because it does not speak for or against segregation. What it says is all neighborhoods in a city should have availability and accessibility to good quality amenities within a 15-minute walking or cycling distance. It's what we, in Gen Urban Space, what we call place-based development, where you pick a neighborhood, you assess its current situation with respect to access to basic amenities and services. So we have framed this AAQ framework, the availability, accessibility, and quality framework, where you're looking at what essential basic services are available, how good is your accessibility to those services. For example, you have a park, every person is entitled, should have 9 square kilometers of open space accessible to them, right? As per WHO standards. So 9 square meter, sorry, not kilometer, 9 square meter. So if you are, it's not just whether a park is available in your vicinity within 15-minute walk or ride, but how accessible is that park? Are you able to walk up to it? Are you able to cycle up to it? Is the infrastructure that is leading up to the road good? Is the park open at viable hours of the day? So things like that, right? Access has like how safe it is for you to travel there, things like that. And then the quality of the infrastructure in itself, that how good is the quality of the public space of the park? Like something that struck us as very odd is if you look at public parks in India, and if you look at children's park in India, almost all parks have play infrastructure for like up to 10 years of age. If you look, there is no infrastructure for teenagers to play in public parks. It's always the slides and the swings and that's not what and then you will see the teenagers, the teenage boys and girls playing on the streets where it is extremely unsafe for them to play. Road safety being another part of the discussion, right? So it's about those things that you assess the quality, accessibility and quality of basic services and amenities, right? And then you decide that what does that particular neighborhood need? So a low income neighborhood might need completely different from what a middle income or a high income or a mixed income neighborhood might need. Right? And then you provide that specific neighborhood with that sort of development. So essentially, I feel like the idea, like when all neighborhoods in a city become 15-minute, you are automatically enabling socioeconomic inclusion. Because if I were to go to an urban poor or a low income settlement and like, let's say one neighborhood in the city of Pune where I stay is it's just low income. It's not even mixed income, right? And I see that they do not have any parks or recreational infrastructure. They do not have any open spaces. My first point of advocacy would be for them to have an open space. My first point of advocacy and first point of development would be to say that you need to have better access. You need to have a well-designed road that leads to a park where children can go, where women can go in the evenings, where men can go, where all sorts of old people can go and walk. So that is what the idea of place-based development and 15-minute neighborhood, the way we envision is, right? It's not to say that all neighborhoods have to have the same form of development. You assess the need and then you decide what that neighborhood needs, and then you do what needs to be done to make sure that the quality of life of citizens in that particular neighborhood is made better. Yeah, that's and also just one more point on, since we are speaking about 15-minute neighborhoods, one point that I want to make is, like you pointed out, this is about essential services, right? So there's also the idea that there are services and amenities that you need within 15-minute walking and cycling. Then there are services and amenities you will need, maybe not in 15-minute walking and cycling. It can be 30 minutes by public transport. It can be 60 minutes by public transport, like an airport or a railway station in 30 minutes. So the way we plan and develop also needs to be centered around those things. Not everybody has to live within very close proximity to an airport or a railway station, but you need public transport that can lead you to that. So what you need is access to a public transport node within 15-minute walking and cycling. So I think that is the way of layered thinking that I think it already exists, but it also needs to be implemented better. And essentially, yeah, that's where the idea of 15-minute neighborhood comes in.
I think you actually addressed a lot of what I think I've seen in terms of criticism of the concept is usually that it implies that some neighborhoods will have an overall lower quality and some neighborhoods will have an overall higher quality. But I think this framing that you just provided actually really clears that up for me, because what you're essentially saying is this is a way of coming up with localized, contextualized policy solutions.
Yes.
So it's more of a planning process than like an idealistic concept of the entire city turning into these perfect 15-minute bubbles, but more like you assess what that 15-minute radius needs and then start there. And then I'm guessing that means after that neighborhood gets a park, then you start thinking about the next biggest need and improving the quality of that service.
Yes. And this is where a large part of the citizen-centric development also comes in. Like you need to involve these people, you need to involve the people who are living there to come up and tell that this is what I need, that maybe 70% of the people in that neighborhood needs a daycare facility. Because that is the work profile or socioeconomic profile of that particular neighborhood. And maybe in some other neighborhood, they just need like a community center. So it's it's like, and I'm just thinking off the top of my head, it could be some other completely different, like a healthcare facility. Some of these facilities have to be there in every neighborhood, we would say, but it also it's not about what has to be there. It's also about like what has to be there in order of priority, right? So what you said comes true there, that first we need this, and once we have this, then we can think of the other steps as and when it comes. So that priority is not the same for every neighborhood across India, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think contextualizing solutions is something
Yeah.
that we all have to end up working on quite a bit. Okay, so this next question is for Karthik. So obviously I'm going by area of expertise and the projects you worked on. So what I'm most excited to ask you about is, with the strong push for electrifying urban mobility through electric vehicles and buses, how far do you think that can take us in terms of achieving a low carbon mobility future? To what extent can it help reduce overall transportation emissions?
Sure. So electric mobility is a very interesting one. Back in 2014, I remember a news article that came out saying that India got its first zero emission bus in Bangalore. I was very excited. I mean, back then I was not in the space. I didn't really understand what zero emission was. But as time progressed, that the meaning of that zero emission, as we just lightly touched upon earlier, came out, right? So it's zero emission, but in certain contexts only. So the zero emission refers to tailpipe emission specifically. Just clearing this up, over the life cycle of a vehicle, right? I'm sure a lot of you know carbon is emitted for producing it, for operating it, and then towards the end of the life to potentially recycle or reuse it. When it comes to electric vehicles, right after the first few kilometers, a person drives a bus or a car, the life cycle emissions for that at that point is still higher than a traditional petrol or a diesel vehicle. Now, this is something that most people don't know about, and many times I have conversations with people who are not very familiar with this topic, and it's interesting to see them change and say, "Oh my God, zero emission vehicles maybe not entirely true." So when it comes to electric vehicles, a couple of things, right? So the crux of emissions for the electric vehicles come from the operating phase. So when you actually run it on the road around 20,000 kilometers, it reaches parity with the petrol and diesel vehicle, and then it gets better over time. So when that happens, you see the real lever there is how the electricity is being produced, right? So are you producing it cleanly through renewable sources? Is it a dirty source like coal and all those kind of things? If you look at India specifically, almost I think just over 50% of power being generated is through fossil fuels. So at this point, if you plug in your electric vehicle, it's not entirely clean the way it's charging. Um, However, coming out of just this electricity debate, electric vehicles do provide a lower carbon source than a low carbon mode of transport than the traditional vehicle. So definitely, a step in the right direction. However, in the large scheme of things, like I think Anna Suryatapa as well mentioned, the real formula is the modal shift. So if we think about the modal shift to public transport, the best way to incorporate electric mobility would be to, fund electric vehicles in public transport like buses and trams and all those things. So when it comes to electric vehicles towards low carbon modes of transport, that is the way to go. And I feel that when you talk about charging infrastructure and all those things that enable it, it definitely makes sense, like best buses in Mumbai are doing, to kind of move all the charging towards renewable sources, potentially through solar panels or wind energy, for that matter. So yeah, when it comes to electric vehicles, I think it's not a one-shot solution. It's probably an intermediate step in a series of steps towards net zero or low emission transport.
Yeah, I think I've been reading a lot more about how they're trying to increase private electric vehicle ownership in India, and I often wonder if maybe the split towards that is too strong compared to the split towards public transport being renewable. We are moving in that direction, but I wonder if, in terms of nudges and behavioral shifts, if there's as much value in private vehicles being electric at the moment compared to improving public transport. But yeah, that's super interesting. And I think a lot of people really don't know this fact that electric vehicles are not zero emission. So that's always important to highlight. Anna, this next question I have is for you. Across the world, getting people to consistently adopt public transport is a challenge. So from a behavioral perspective, what are some of the key barriers that you've noticed deter people from using public transport the most?
Yeah, I mean, the simple answer is infrastructure, right? If we don't have the infrastructure for public transport, people are not going to engage in that behavior. They won't use it. But even in countries like Austria and Germany, where I grew up, we have quite a decent infrastructure for sustainable modes of transport, and many people still prefer cars. So this already indicates that infrastructure isn't the only answer, and there are some more behavioral barriers to it. I would say, from my perspective, there are three main barriers. The first one being easiness. So people often perceive that it's not easy to engage in sustainable transport. It's cited as one of the hardest decisions to make to live car-free, which I find is a bit hilarious, but it's one of the most high impact decisions that you can make to reduce your carbon emissions. But people find it very hard, and it does require breaking with habits. And it does require to maybe learn how to safely ride a bike or to navigate, roads as a pedestrian. So there's a certain skill set that you would also have to acquire. The second thing is, besides easiness, is attractiveness. So many people would say it's unattractive to use sustainable mobility. If you have to squeeze into, a metro with many people, you arrive sweaty, you don't know if it's reliable. In contrast, driving with a private vehicle seems so comfortable. It seems to give you personal space. And as Kartik mentioned earlier, it does convey a certain status. And on that note, I want to say that it doesn't have to be like that. In Germany, where I grew up, the car lobby is very strong. Everyone loves cars, and you should have 2 or 3 cars in front of your house to show all your neighbors of how great of a person you are, and so on, and convey your status. But in France, where my partner comes from, the car industry isn't as strong, and so people really don't care so much about cars. They have small cars. It's not so much of a status symbol, which also shows you that it doesn't have to be like that. So besides easiness and attractiveness, a third thing, I think that Suryatapa, you already touched a bit upon when you were talking about the parks, is social aspects. So we know that people often underestimate the support that there is for low carbon mobility, or also low carbon policies. It's called pluralistic ignorance, and I want to give you an example. I went to this sustainable mobility conference in Austria, and I went by bike. So I had my helmet, and I looked around, and no one else had a helmet. And I thought, well, that's odd. We're talking about sustainable mobility here. I felt like so isolated. I felt like I'm the only one here fighting for this. But when preparing for this talk, I reflected upon it, and I thought, well, maybe they came by public transport, so they wouldn't need a helmet. But initially, you're just feeling like you're on your own in this challenge, in this endeavor. And so making it a social thing would be also really important as well.
Yeah, you were mentioning comfort in traveling alone in your car. I was thinking about how people would prefer to be alone on their commute than to be with other people, which maybe wasn't, I mean, I don't want to speak for people before my time, but I don't think that was always true. So that's definitely something that hopefully behavioral shifts will change over time. But yeah, it's very interesting to hear about that, especially the differences between France and Germany. Do you feel that French public transport is compensated enough for the lack of private vehicle ownership? Just as a side question that I didn't plan on asking.
Yeah, I don't have numbers or so, but the thing is, private vehicle ownership is still very high in France. It's just that the cars itself are smaller and they look less fancy, and people care less about them, and they often have also used cars or so on. I think this is the major difference. I think the modal split isn't so different, unfortunately, between those two countries. Yeah.
Can I ask a question here?
Yeah, please.
What about this year, you, Anna? What about safety? Is that a significant factor behind why people might not be willing to use public transport or yeah?
It definitely is. I mean, if we're looking at the context of India or developing countries, I would say safety is an issue. But then again, if we look at objective safety, like in Austria, where I live, in Vienna, in the city, many people are using public transport, and it's across all age ranges. Even young school kids are going unobserved to school with the metro and so on. So safety is not the only answer, but definitely it's really important. And it's not just about objective safety. So of course you can install cameras and so on.
Yeah.
But it's also about perceived safety. And that comes more by having people walk around in safety vests, by feeling not alone on the platform and so on. So it's not just objective measures of you have a button where you could click and call someone for help. It's also about how it feels.
Yeah, just to add to that, one of the most interesting things I found, which I personally experienced on the Mumbai local, is that people who commute, they find a group within the compartments. They know exactly where they need to be situated in the train, and they do like prayers, they sing songs and everything. And I've spoken to some of them. It's very interesting to see that that specific activity incentivizes them to go to a certain train, certain carriage, take a certain type of transport even. I mean, Mumbai maybe not so, but potentially in other cities. So that entire aspect of you being able to do another activity while traveling, maybe even catching up on sleep, right, is something that's significant that public transport offers, which private transport does not offer. I mean, you have to sit there and stare at the road for an hour driving, right?
Not to take away from the seriousness of it, but I believe this actually I think it's a Japanese TV show where you follow like children who are so young, like below the age of 10, as they navigate their city by themselves using the public transport, going to get groceries and all of that, because culturally independence is focused on a lot. So they're encouraged to do that. And because the culture does that, you're kind of all in it together. You all have to protect all the kids, your kids, their kids, everyone's kids. So public transport might even be extra safety compared to, say, cycling, which isn't public transport, but you're doing it alone. So yeah, that's a very, very interesting cultural aspect of these behavior shifts. I'm going to quickly jump into the next question. I'll again start with Surya Tapat for this one. So Jana Urban Mobility has been working on low carbon mobility solutions for many years, from the 15-minute city guidelines to the complete streets framework in Bangalore. What are some of the key challenges in implementing these solutions, and what do you think can be done to address them?
It's a big question. I will try to structure it in sort of like 3 key areas that we anyway work in, but starting from policy. I think the biggest challenge is the change in mindset and vision for decision makers and bureaucrats who actually enable this sort of infrastructure development, right? Because public space development is whole and soul in the hands of public authorities. In very limited cases, we have PPP partnerships, but even then, it is public land, so we do need their permission to and go ahead to even do any sort of intervention, right? So the first is always the mindset change, the vision change with this decision makers, right? And here it's like it's a simple question that we have always been asking. It's like, what is the end goal, right? Do you want to transport people and goods from A to B, or do you want to transport cars from A to B? It's something as simple as that. Like, what is it that you're trying to do, right? Roads carry people, goods, services. But to be honest, the challenges go beyond that. Like, if you look at roads, urban roads, it's like it carries people, goods, services, And utilities from the city, stormwater, sewage, water supply, gas, electric conduits, everything is going either above or underneath the road, right? So I think a lot of decision makers, even experts and consumers fail to look at this holistic perspective. So when you actually go in and try to target this and present this scenario that when you build a road, you also need to build what is going subsurface, right? Like the utility chambers that, because if you look in India, the reason we have this like cyclical notion of like digging, redigging roads every monsoon, everywhere across the country, you will see all these workers just like digging up the road, fixing some sewer line, fixing some electric line, cleaning the stormwater drains. The problem is that because you have these utilities somewhere under the road carriageway, whereas in a very designed, in a very sort of formalized way of road design and building, you have the utilities shifted underneath the footpath, and you have manholes at, let's say, 100, 200 meters based on the need for cleaning, etc., need for accessing those services. That way, you're not disturbing pedestrian traffic, you're not disturbing cycle traffic, you're not disturbing the cars and the other motorized transport, right? There is a system to it that people and most importantly, decision makers and bureaucrats do not understand and see. Good news is that this is something that is changing a little bit. I mean, people are increasingly, and given the increased extreme weather events across the country, the amount of like urban floods that we are looking at, which is completely development driven, right? It's because your cities are not able to absorb the storm water at source, or not able to channelize and channelize that storm water. Now decision makers are increasingly starting to understand that yes, this also needs to be designed when we design a road. So one is equitable distribution of road space, then all these utilities, etc. So one is the biggest changes, of course, again going back to in the mindset. The second is the second part is in creating mandates. So we can have as many frameworks, guidelines, etc., developed as possible, as humanly possible by policy experts, etc. But if these are not mandated across state or at the union level, or even at a city level, this will never be implemented, because the people who are implementing public infrastructure, the people who are actually going down to the ground and building this infrastructure are municipal engineers and contractors, right? It is not people like we are the designers, but we are actually not the ones who are actually going on road and building it. So unless some of these things have been mandated, this can't be implemented at scale. That's another thing. So just to give you a little bit of an example here, something that we have been working in Jan Urban space is advocating and building an alternate schedule of rates. So a lot of you might be aware a schedule of rate is a rate document that contractors look at when they have to put the quotations for a bid, right? So they want to build a certain road. They will look at the materials that are available for developing the carriageway, for developing the footpath, for the medians, what and what not, all the design elements, and they will look at what is already available in that schedule of rate documents, and based on that, they will give the quotations. And when they actually when they win the bid and go to actually implement that, they're going to use the same materials because that's what they have quoted on. So unless you have alternate materials, sustainable building materials, sustainable construction techniques actually institutionalized in that document, and this document is prepared by the Central Public Works Department and then adapted in a localized context by different states. So you have the state PWDs that make their own versions of it based on their labor charges, their machinery charges, transportation cost, etc., like context specific changes, right? Not to get into too much technicalities in it, but this is a very important document that not a people realize needs to change, right? So when you are actually we can speak there are gazillion sustainable materials out there. In India, manufacturers are manufacturing alternate sustainable green materials, green from the source, right? So using less energy during manufacturing, using less energy for transportation, during construction, during operation maintenance, and during the end life cycle, as Karthik had mentioned earlier, right? So there are materials existing out there, but if this is not institutionalized in that document, no contractor is going to use it, because nobody is going to do this work, sit and look at, okay, this is a material, let me get vendor quotations from 5 different vendors, let me first find those vendors. Somebody has to do this work, and then it has to be institutionalized. And then that is how you drive this sort of system change, right? So advocacy in itself, advocacy is a big step in the game, and it is very important for us to do it and do it aggressively unless we get what we want. But we also need to look at this bits and pieces in the implementation mechanisms of these regulations, policies, etc., and identify that, okay, this needs to change, and this is how I change it. So instead of just doing it downstream, you need to look at what part of the process needs to be changed, at which node we need to create this change, and so this is where mandates, etc., come in. The second big part is professional development.
Sorry to cut you off. I have to add that we don't have quite enough time, so I'll just ask you to summarize the last 2 points just so I can get to the other questions.
Fair enough. I'll just be quick. Professional development, so people who are actually building things on ground, there has to be continuous skill-based development for them. There has to be interagency coordination between different utility departments, line departments, different state departments, ministries, etc. And the final part is, again, going back, this is very important, but I'll not spend too much time on it, is the behavior change and acceptance, right? So something we saw in Tendershire roads, people are bound to be affected by this sort of public infrastructure development, right? So because their day-to-day life is getting affected, but once they actually see the value that it brings, they themselves become champions to this thing. So yeah, quick win projects, lighthouse projects, very necessary to sort of create this sort of mindset shift in delivering what we need to deliver. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I have to keep everyone slightly on a tighter schedule so that we have enough time for audience questions. So please forgive me for cutting people off. Sorry about that. My next question is for Karthik. What would you say the role of data and tech or technology is in driving low carbon mobility? And if you could highlight some key examples of how technology is creating more efficient and sustainable transport systems in cities around the world, given your experience.
Sure. I think when it comes to technology, a kind of group of fields that I've been working on is called case mobility. So it encompasses connected, autonomous, shared, and electric vehicle modes. As we already discussed, electric vehicles probably a step in the process towards low carbon mobility. However, probably not the ultimate goal. But when we look at other technologies out there that's helping us drive this transition, an interesting one is actually shared mobility. And within that comes things like car share, micro mobility modes, and also something that many of you probably know called mobility as a service. And this is a very interesting one because it combines a couple of things like data, technology, and since almost everyone has a phone now, very easily accessible. So one of the interesting applications here is, I think we already spoke about how we need to push people towards making that modal shift, going to public transport, taking more non-motorized modes of mobility, right? In that respect, one of the key aspects is to make that transition easier. So if someone wants to go from a position, a point A to point B, if they take a car, it would typically be door to door. However, when it comes to public transport, you have to walk to a bus stop, take a bus, then maybe take a bike share to get to your final destination. And typically, one of the biggest barriers for that is you have to go through your mobile, go to one app, book a bike share, then potentially buy a ticket on the bus, and then potentially figure out, okay, is there a way I can get to my final destination without walking? Is there some scooter or something? There are certain countries that have done a very good job in integrating all of that. Basically, you put in your origin destination, and you get a single ticket that combines all modes, and you don't even have to pay a ticket because you have a yearly pass. So that makes your life really easy. In India, the first step towards that, I know that there are a couple of startups like Chalo, which is doing a good job. They They have around 50 cities, I think, in India. And you can purchase tickets in any one of the cities at the same time. So that's the kind of ease of integration I'm talking about when it comes to shared mobility. Back to electric mobility, one of the interesting things is AI is a buzzword nowadays, but data when it comes to charging has been used in many places outside India to kind of optimize the consumption of electricity and also find where these electric charging stations need to be placed. And I think when it comes to India, which is still kind of young and early in the EV transition, this is something that can help a lot, kind of drive that transition forward. And then some examples, I think, so in the interest of time, I'll probably highlight one good example here, which is I recently spoke to the Finnish government, and they're creating this multimodal system. I think they've already implemented a lot of it. Like I said, where you have one ticket for going from point A to B, and they've also included international destinations in Estonia, which I feel is very, very, very interesting. India has a couple of their own neighbors, very friendly neighbors. And I feel like if we really want to create a holistic system, even the short distances and long distances is something that could be explored over here.
Yeah, that sounds really wonderful. And honestly, as an Indian citizen, I would really like that as well. And our metro system already does it's starting to use those sort of apps and things. So I can see those things making a real difference already. For Anna, lucky for me, and in the interest of time, the question I had prepared is very similar to one that the audience asked. So I'm going to read mine and then tack on the specifics from the audience. So drawing on the work you've done with the London Tube, as well as the work you're doing in Austria, what are some of the effective behavioral strategies that cities and transit agencies can implement to improve public transport adoption and retentions? And do you think there are any lessons for cities in the global south, which hopefully covers your question, Anand, who's in the chat?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I do want to mention that I didn't work for London Tube though, so I don't want to claim credit for that. And I also want to thank my friend Justness from Busara, who helped me contextualize the thoughts I have on best practices and so on, and transferring them to cities in the global south. I want to come back to the three barriers that I talked about. So easiness, attractiveness, and social aspects. Easiness, so increasing easiness is especially important for the most vulnerable groups. Low carbon mobility should be a no-brainer. It shouldn't put people into a financial dilemma. We've already talked about very diverse needs and making it a safe endeavor for everyone. And I think what Kartik said about the multimodal apps was really interesting. And I want to mention a best practice from Austria where, so when you want to use the train, there's multiple tickets and you really don't, it's too much cognitively to process what ticket is optimal for you now for the trips that you're going to take. And so what they did is they partnered with a startup from Switzerland, Fairtick, who are basically providing this app where you can just check in and check out. And so you check in, you go on train A, then you take bus B, and then you take tram C and whatever, and you check out. And the system of them is just calculating within a certain amount of time whatever ticket would be cheapest for you. So if you take a lot of trips during the 24 hours, for example, then you get 24-hour tickets. If you take only a few trips, then it would charge you for a single ride. And I think like making things easy for people is one key topic and best practice. The second one, attractiveness. So making sustainable transport modes more attractive. This is especially important, I think, for working professionals and also wealthy individuals who contribute disproportionately to the emissions. And here, Suryatapa had really interesting points that she mentioned, I think, where you said you need to do quick win projects. And I want to highlight that and say, from a behavioral perspective also, if you're coming up with new ideas, for example, you want to have a car-free Sunday, you're competing with systems and policies that have been implemented for ages already. And you're competing with an idea with just words, and maybe you have a fancy slide set. So what you need to do is to run pilots. You need to make people experience the thing see how they feel about it, and then talk to them and evaluate whether it's feasible. Because otherwise you can never win in this kind of comparison game with your new ideas. So really run pilots, implement things. We have these super Gratzels in Vienna where we shut off certain areas to cars. We do silent disco there or so. And before, people are always upset. But then when they've tried it out, they kind of like it. So really use the psychological factors and the knowledge to get people's buy-in. And another part of attractiveness is also to use the right kind of framing. So with sustainability, you're not going to get the masses anymore. Here in Austria, at least, it's the case that if you want to be green or behave green, these people have already changed their behaviors, but we want to help the masses to engage in low carbon mobility. And Kartik, you mentioned these commuter cycles, for example, in Mumbai. This is the exact thing. So being social is a benefit that you don't have as much in a private vehicle as you can have it in public transport. Sell that, or maybe that you can utilize your time. We've run interviews with people, and they said they like trains because they don't have to drive, it's comfortable, but they can also utilize their time. What we're trying now is to communicate, oh, it's so sustainable to go to holiday with the train. But instead, people care about, oh, I can work on the train, or oh, I can play games with my friends on the train. We have to communicate the things and the dimensions that people care about and that we can compete on, rather than trying to compete on dimensions like timing or time efficiency that we can't win with public transport. And on the social aspects, role models are super important. So in Austria, the president is often seen riding the metro. It fits a bit to what you said in the beginning with the Bogota mayor's quote. If you see the people that citizens look up to riding in public transport, this can be really inspiring. So we need these kind of role models. And more importantly also, I talked about habit changes in the beginning. So it's very hard to change habits unless you have a window of opportunity. One window of opportunity is when people's life changes. So for us, it's often when people are turning 18, they often move out and so on. And so in Austria, we give everyone with the age of 18 a 1-year free public transport tickets, which is financially a good thing, but also it establishes a habit at a time when habits can easily be established. So timing of interventions is another important fact. And to talk a bit about partnerships and technological solutions as well, my personal opinion is that a bit as Kartik said, the technological solutions alone won't suffice, they won't help. I mean, we need to actively shape a human-centered transition. And I do think that partnerships between public, private, companies have data, they want to see where their services can sell. Policymakers provide the vision, they provide the regulations, the incentives, and so on. Urban designers can implement this. And last but not least, the users, which need to be in the center of all of this. If you make them come together, then we can have the systemic redesign. If you only have the silos and everyone works for themselves, you're only optimizing locally. You won't have systematic change. And now, as I work in innovation, we often talk about ideas that scale, and I think that's even more important in the global south. Given the population growth, we need ideas that scale. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I actually think you have kind of segued. I'm going to use this. If you all have another 5 minutes to stay on, I can keep you all here. But one of the questions that I think is related to what you just answered is the question seems to be both for you, Ms. Dox, and for Suryatapa as well. There are a lot of public transport vehicles in India that are not very well maintained. For example, old vehicles without PUC that release a lot of smoke, unhygienic interiors. With all of these factors, behavioral shifts also become a little difficult. How can the public take an active stance to advocate for these changes? In case you have a response to that. Though I know as people who are working on these issues, one of the main ways is that's what we're trying to design as ways for them to be actively involved in those policies. But if you've heard of anything successful, we can maybe highlight that here.
I can only speak about the Austrian context because I don't know how it is organized in India, but we do have a lot of citizen initiatives. So it's not party or governmental related, but it's really citizens getting together in local groups and organizing themselves and advocating for a certain kind of initiative that they want to happen. I'm not sure if this really works for such a large scale infrastructural problem as non-maintained public transport. So I do think you need to basically intervene on all layers. You need to have these initiatives. You need to vote the governments or elect the parties or people in positions of power that you think can change it. You need to advocate very strongly in media and so on. So really give it all you got, basically, to try to shift the norm towards change becoming inevitable, also in this infrastructural manner.
It's definitely something that's difficult, and that's something that that advocacy around this has been there for a significant amount of time. But like I said, changes, like we all think, change is a little slow. But one thing, and this I speak in the context of Bangalore because that's where we are headquartered and I have most knowledge about that particular place, is there are a lot of like citizen groups and civic groups that sort of formalize, I think like Anna said, they formalize, and then once you have collected significant amount of support for that, you can actually approach your local leaders, because that's the first step for you to go. So in the case of Bangalore, you have ward councillors and your local sort of MLAs, etc. I think people usually typically go to the ward councillors and then MLAs, and this also applies to I'm from Guwahati. I know it applies to Guwahati. I don't know whether it applies to every city. Unfortunately, I do not work very strongly in citizen participation, but I do know that the first step is, if you have a problem and if you do not already have a formalized system of engagement with your local leaders, then there are citizen groups, etc., or at least you can form a citizen group and then approach. Once you have significant amount of strength, then you can approach your local leaders, and that is one of the first steps of advocacy that you can take. As and when your size increases, I think you can take it up in media, you can take it up in bigger platforms, and that puts enough, and because this is the beauty of a democracy, I feel like it puts enough pressure on your local leadership to act to those particular changes. And this is why we vote for our constituent MLAs, etc. Not to get into a different discussion altogether, but I think that's a very good way, and that's a very foolproof way to sort of start in this and then see where it takes you on a bigger stage. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. In the interest of time, and also because the final question is very specific to Panjim, which is one of Pole's project cities, so I'm not entirely sure I can make you all answer the question. I will wrap this up with just a quick summary of what all we've discussed today and just some of the key highlights. First of all, thank you all so much for speaking with me today. I've had so much new information, and I'm really excited to have had this conversation, so thank you. But yeah, just to pull out some of the highlights, we've heard so much from you, Anna, about how behavior shift and normative shifts are very necessary, about the need for just and fair transitions, especially in developing countries, and from all of your research that you've done, both in Austria and abroad in general. I think we've learned a lot from that. And from Suryatapa, I think the localized and contextualized solutioning that you've talked about has been really helpful, especially in understanding some of the behavioral shift suggestions that Anna was talking about. So that was really interesting, especially how 15-minute cities work and the framework of that, and how I think the most important part, which is implementation at a local scale in India, has its own barriers and its own successes that require specific focus and study to solve those problems. And then, of course, from Karthik, everything I've learned about urban mobility and case mobility especially was extremely interesting. And I think we're on that path. So I have a lot of hope as a young Indian citizen that all of these things will actually come to fruition eventually. So yeah, thank you all so much. And with that, I'll wrap this up. For our participants, please do stay tuned to our website and our social media, because we'll be posting a summary of this, and please share it with anyone you think would be interested. Thank you all for taking out the time.
Thank you. This has been very
Thank you.
exciting and a good learning experience for me as well.
Thanks a lot, everyone. Yeah, for me too.
Thank you. Thanks, Shanta, for coordinating this. Appreciate it.